Little girl calls 911 in Ophthalmo. My eyes hurt after Dad threw that thing in them. Doctor cry. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The phone call came through at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, crackling with static and fear. The dispatcher, Maria Santos, had handled hundreds of emergency calls in her 12 years on the job, but something about the small, trembling voice on the other end made her blood run cold. "My eyes are burning," the child whispered, her words breaking between sobs. "Daddy, he threw something and it got in my eyes and it hurt so much." Maria kept her voice steady, asking the address, dispatching paramedics, but her hands shook as she typed. When the ambulance arrived at the small house on Maple Street, they found the front door wide open, lights blazing inside, but no adult present. Only a little girl in a stained nightgown, tears streaming down reddened cheeks, hands pressed against her face as she rocked back and forth on the porch steps. At Riverside Community Hospital, Dr. Eleanor Hayes was finishing her shift when the paramedics rushed through the emergency entrance. Eleanor had been a physician for 32 years, had seen more broken bones, illnesses, and emergencies than she could count, but something about this particular case made her pause at the nurse's station. "What do we have?" she asked, already pulling on fresh gloves. 7-year-old female, chemical exposure to the eyes, arrived alone, the paramedic reported, his expression troubled. "Father called it in but wasn't there when we arrived. No other family located." Eleanor moved quickly into the examination room where the child sat hunched on the paper-covered table, a nurse gently trying to irrigate her eyes with saline. The girl flinched at every touch, making small, wounded sounds that reminded Eleanor painfully of injured animals she'd tried to help as a child on her grandmother's farm. "Hello, sweetheart," Eleanor said softly, pulling up a stool to sit at eye level. "My name is Dr. Hayes, but you can call me Dr. Eleanor. Can you tell me your name?" The child's lips moved silently at first, then whispered, "Lily." As Eleanor carefully examined the girl's eyes under the light, checking for corneal damage, she noticed other things that had nothing to do with the chemical burn. The child's arms were thin, too thin, the bones visible beneath pale skin marked with fading bruises in various stages of healing. Her hair was matted and unwashed, her nightgown worn thin with holes near the hem. But it was the look in Lily's eyes that struck Eleanor most deeply. A wariness, a readiness to flinch, the expression of someone much older than 7 who had learned that the world was not a safe place. "Lily, honey, you're being so brave," Eleanor murmured as she worked, her arthritic fingers moving carefully despite the ache in her joints. "The burning should start feeling better soon. Can you tell me what happened?" Lily's small body went rigid. She stared at the floor, picking at a loose thread on her nightgown. "It was an accident," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to make him mad." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Maggie, the nurse assisting her. Maggie, who was barely 30 but had the kind heart that made her perfect for pediatric cases, gently squeezed Lily's hand. "You're not in any trouble, sweetheart," Maggie assured her. "We just want to help you feel better." As the medical team worked through the night treating Lily's injuries, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong beyond the obvious. The chemical burn was moderate, likely from a cleaning product, and would heal with proper care. But the other signs, the ones that spoke of long-term neglect, those told a different story entirely. The emergency room was relatively quiet that night, giving Eleanor time to sit with Lily, to observe the way the child held herself with such careful stillness, as if taking up too much space might be dangerous. She noticed how Lily watched every person who entered the room, tracking their movements with the hyper-vigilance of someone who'd learned to anticipate trouble before it arrived. Around 3 a.m., when Lily had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep in one of the observation rooms, Eleanor sat in her office staring at the preliminary paperwork. She should have gone home hours ago. Her shift had officially ended at midnight, and she could feel exhaustion pulling at her bones, making her arthritis flare worse than usual. But she couldn't leave. Not yet. "You should go home, Eleanor," said Dr. Thomas Brennan, the hospital administrator, appearing in her doorway with his usual clipboard and expression of mild disapproval. "We have the overnight staff to handle the case." "Where's the father?" Eleanor asked, ignoring his suggestion. Dr. Brennan sighed, adjusting his glasses in that particular way he had when he was about to cite policy. "Still no sign of him. I've called social services. They'll send someone in the morning to assess the situation." "The morning?" Eleanor's voice rose slightly. "Thomas, that child is 7 years old and showed up here alone with a chemical burn and obvious signs of long-term neglect. This can't wait until morning." "Protocol is protocol, Eleanor," Dr. Brennan replied, his tone brooking no argument. "Without clear evidence of intentional harm, we follow procedure. Social services will handle it during business hours. I understand your concern, but we must work within the system." "The system is failing that child," Eleanor said quietly, but Dr. Brennan had already turned to leave, moving on to other administrative matters that demanded his attention. After he left, Eleanor sat alone in her office, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, casting harsh shadows across the stacks of patient files on her desk. She thought about her own grandchildren, safe and loved in their homes across the country, and felt anger rise hot in her chest. She thought about Lily, sleeping fitfully down the hall, and knew with absolute certainty that this was not a case she could simply hand off and forget. When morning light finally crept through the hospital windows, painting the sterile corridors in shades of gray and gold, Eleanor made her way back to Lily's room. The little girl was awake, sitting up in the hospital bed, her eyes bandaged, but her head turning toward every sound as if constantly alert for danger. A breakfast tray sat untouched on the table beside her, though Eleanor could see the way Lily's small hands kept moving toward it and then pulling back, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to eat. "Good morning, Lily," Eleanor said gently, settling into the chair beside the bed. "How are your eyes feeling this morning?" "Better," Lily whispered. "Thank you for making them stop burning." "You're very welcome, sweetheart. I see you haven't eaten your breakfast yet. Are you hungry?" Lily nodded hesitantly, and Eleanor lifted the tray, placing it carefully on the child's lap. "Go ahead, honey. This is for you." She watched as Lily ate slowly at first, then with increasing speed, as if afraid the food might disappear if she didn't finish it quickly. The child consumed everything on the plate, even the vegetables that most children her age would push aside, and Eleanor felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. This was a child who knew what it meant to be hungry, who had learned not to waste any food that came her way. "Lily, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Are you safe at home? Has anyone hurt you on purpose?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Lily's small hands gripped the edge of the blanket so tightly her knuckles turned white. Several long moments passed before she spoke, and when she did, her voice was hollow with the weight of a lie told too many times. "I'm just clumsy," she finally said, staring at her hands rather than meeting Eleanor's eyes. "I fall down a lot. Daddy says I need to be more careful. He says I'm always getting into things I shouldn't." Eleanor's heart broke a little more with each word. She reached out slowly, giving Lily time to pull away if she wanted, and gently placed her hand over the child's small one. The girl's fingers were cold despite the warm hospital room, and Eleanor could feel them trembling slightly beneath her palm. "You know what? I think you're very brave and very careful, and I'm going to make sure you're safe. That's a promise, and I always keep my promises." For the first time since arriving at the hospital, Lily's rigid posture softened slightly. A single tear slipped from beneath the bandage covering her eyes, tracking slowly down her pale cheek. "My daddy didn't mean it," she whispered, her voice catching on the words. "He was crying too. He kept saying he was sorry, but then he left and I didn't know what to do. I tried to wash my eyes, but it hurt so much, and I was scared. So I called the number like Mrs. Martinez taught us at school." Eleanor felt her chest tighten at the image this painted. A 7-year-old child, alone and in pain, having the presence of mind to call for help while her father disappeared into the night. She spent the rest of the morning gathering information, making phone calls, and carefully documenting every bruise, every sign of malnourishment, every indicator that this child had been living in a situation no child should endure. She took photographs with the careful precision of someone who knew these images might be the difference between safety and danger for a vulnerable child. She measured the circumference of Lily's thin arms, noted the prominence of her ribs, documented the fading bruises in shades of yellow and green that spoke of injuries sustained weeks ago. When Sarah Chen from Child Protective Services finally arrived around noon, Eleanor had compiled a report that left no room for doubt that Lily was at serious risk. Sarah, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, but a weariness that spoke of too many cases and not enough resources, reviewed the file with a grim expression that deepened with each page she turned. "The address is in the Riverside Flats area," Sarah said, looking up from the paperwork. "We've had calls from that neighborhood before. High poverty, high unemployment, lots of families struggling to make ends meet. The father, Robert Sullivan, has a record: public intoxication, disorderly conduct, nothing violent but a clear pattern of alcohol-related incidents going back several years. The mother—" She paused, flipping through papers, and Eleanor saw something shift in her expression. The mother, Catherine Sullivan, was admitted to Clearwater Psychiatric Facility 3 years ago, diagnosed with severe schizophrenia following a mental health crisis where she tried to harm herself. She's still there, likely will be for the foreseeable future. Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. So Lily has been alone with her father for 3 years, and he's been struggling with alcoholism that entire time. "It's complicated," Sarah said, though her tone suggested she agreed with Eleanor's assessment. "We'll need to investigate, interview the father when we locate him, assess the home environment. I'll need to speak with neighbors, school officials, anyone who has regular contact with the family. These things take time, Dr. Hayes. I know that's frustrating, but we have to build a solid case if we're going to intervene effectively." "That child doesn't have time," Eleanor said firmly, leaning forward in her chair. "She's 7 years old and she's been living in conditions that would be unacceptable for anyone, let alone a child. How many more nights does she have to spend wondering if her father will come home, if there will be food, if she'll be safe?" Sarah met her eyes with understanding but also frustration, the look of someone who'd fought this battle many times before. "I know, Dr. Hayes. Believe me, I know. But I work within a system that's overloaded and underfunded. I have 43 active cases right now, and that's actually fewer than some of my colleagues. I'll do everything I can for Lily, but I need you to understand that unless we find evidence of immediate danger, my hands may be tied by legal requirements and resource constraints." As Sarah left to begin her investigation, Eleanor returned to Lily's room. The little girl was picking at the lunch tray that had been brought to her, eating slowly as if savoring each bite, making the food last. Eleanor noticed she'd eaten everything on the plate, even arranged the napkin and utensils neatly the way a child might, who'd been taught to appreciate things others took for granted. "Dr. Eleanor?" Lily's small voice drew her attention. "Are you going to leave too? Everyone always leaves eventually." The question, asked with such careful neutrality as if trying not to show how much the answer mattered, nearly undid Eleanor's professional composure. She sat down on the edge of the bed and took Lily's hand, feeling the small fingers curl around hers with surprising strength. "I'm going to stay right here as long as you need me," she said firmly. "That's another promise, and like I told you before, I always keep my promises." Lily nodded slowly, processing this information with the seriousness of someone much older. Then she whispered something so quietly, Eleanor almost missed it, words that would echo in her mind for days to come. "Nobody ever keeps promises at my house. My daddy promises he won't drink anymore, but then he does. He promised my mama would come home, but she never did. He promised things would get better, but they just got worse." That night, as Eleanor finally drove home to her empty house in the suburbs, she thought about promises and what they meant. Her husband, Michael, had been gone for 5 years now, his heart giving out one morning while he read the newspaper at their kitchen table. She still remembered that morning with painful clarity, the newspaper sliding from his hands, the coffee cup tipping over, the desperate minutes of trying to revive him while waiting for the ambulance that would arrive too late. Her children, David and Anna, lived states away with families of their own, visiting on holidays but building their own lives as children should. The house that had once been filled with noise and love and the chaos of family life now echoed with silence. She had thrown herself into work, taking extra shifts, volunteering for difficult cases, anything to avoid going home to that silence, to rooms that still held Michael's presence in every photograph and piece of furniture. But this case felt different. This wasn't about avoiding her own loneliness or filling empty hours. This was about a child who had been invisible to a world too busy or too broken to see her suffering. And Eleanor could not, would not, let that continue. As Eleanor lay in bed that night, sleep eluding her despite her exhaustion, she made a decision. She would not let Lily disappear into the cracks of an overwhelmed system. She would not let this be another case file that gathered dust while a child's life hung in the balance. Whatever it took, however much she had to fight, she would keep the promise she'd made to a frightened little girl in a hospital room. The next morning, Eleanor woke before dawn, her body protesting the lack of rest, her joints aching more than usual from arthritis that seemed to worsen with stress and fatigue. She ignored the pain, swallowed her medication with black coffee, and drove back to the hospital before her shift officially started, unable to stay away. When she entered Lily's room, she found the child already awake, sitting up in bed, her bandages changed but her expression still guarded, still waiting for the next bad thing to happen. "Did you really come back?" Lily asked, something like wonder creeping into her voice, as if the concept of an adult following through was foreign and miraculous. "I told you I would," Eleanor replied simply, pulling a chair close to the bed. "And I'm going to keep coming back. You can count on that." And in that moment, looking at the small figure in the hospital bed, Eleanor understood that this was no longer just a medical case. This was personal. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged that felt both healing and heartbreaking. Eleanor stayed at the hospital far longer than her shifts required, checking on Lily multiple times each day, bringing books from home to read aloud, coaxing smiles from the withdrawn child. She brought simple things, a soft blanket from her linen closet because Lily complained the hospital ones were scratchy, a stuffed bear that had belonged to her daughter Anna, coloring books and crayons to give the child something to do during the long hours. Maggie and the other nurses noticed but said nothing, understanding that sometimes medicine was about more than treating physical injuries, that healing required attention to wounds that didn't show up on charts or scans. Lily began to open up in small ways, like a flower unfurling petals in uncertain sunlight, talking about school, which she loved because it's warm and they have snacks and nobody yells, mentioning her teacher, Mrs. Martinez, who was really nice and never yells even when kids are bad, describing the few friends she had made, particularly a girl named Emma who shared her lunch sometimes when Lily didn't have one. But whenever conversation turned toward home, toward her father, she would retreat into silence, her small face closing off like a door slamming shut against unwelcome intrusion. Meanwhile, Sarah Chen investigated the home on Maple Street, and what she found confirmed Eleanor's worst fears, while also complicating the simple narrative of neglect. The house was barely livable. Minimal furniture consisting mostly of a sagging couch and a small table, a refrigerator containing mostly beer and condiments with almost no proper food for a growing child. Lily's bedroom was a tiny space that might have originally been a storage closet, with a mattress on the floor, one thin blanket despite temperatures that dropped near freezing at night, and a single stuffed animal that looked like it had been mended dozens of times with careful stitches. There were no toys, no books beyond a few tattered volumes that appeared to have come from a school donation program, no evidence of the things a 7-year-old should have access to. But there were also signs of someone trying, failing, but trying. Dishes washed and stacked neatly despite being mismatched and chipped, clothes that were worn but clean, hanging in Lily's tiny closet, school papers displayed on the refrigerator with the kind of parental pride that suggested love existed, even if resources didn't. Neighbors reported that Robert Sullivan was not a bad man, just broken. Someone who had lost his factory job when the plant closed 2 years ago and had been spiraling downward ever since. They'd seen Lily walking to school alone in all weather, noticed she was often outside late at night when other children were inside being tucked into bed, heard shouting from the house, but nothing they felt rose to the level of calling authorities. "We all have our struggles," one neighbor said to Sarah, defensive and guilty in equal measure. "Who are we to judge? We figured someone official must know about the situation, must be helping. We didn't want to make things worse for them by getting involved." The picture that emerged was not of deliberate cruelty, but of profound neglect, born from a man so consumed by his own pain and addiction that he had failed to see the child depending on him slowly fading away, becoming invisible in her own home. When Sarah shared her findings with Eleanor over coffee in the hospital cafeteria on the 3rd day of Lily's stay, she also revealed something that changed the context of everything. "I pulled hospital records from other facilities in the county," Sarah explained, stirring sugar into her coffee with mechanical precision. "Lily was treated for a broken arm 18 months ago at Mercy General. The report said she fell downstairs in their home. Then 6 months after that, she was treated at County Hospital for a burn on her shoulder. The report said she accidentally touched a hot stove while trying to cook dinner for herself and her father." Eleanor felt rage building in her chest like pressure in a sealed container. How did no one see the pattern? How did no one connect these incidents and realize this child was in danger? Different hospitals, different doctors, overworked staff, and no centralized system for tracking these cases across facilities, Sarah said wearily, repeating explanations she'd given too many times to too many people who asked the same justified questions. Cases slip through the cracks. It's the reality of our system, and it's a reality that fails vulnerable children every single day. I've been doing this work for 15 years, and it never gets easier to explain how we let children down. "That's not good enough," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "That little girl has been suffering for years, probably her entire life since her mother became ill, and our system failed her at every turn. We failed her." "I know," Sarah replied quietly, meeting Eleanor's eyes with the tired solidarity of someone who'd fought this fight many times. "And I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure it doesn't fail her again. But Dr. Hayes, you need to prepare yourself for disappointment. Even with everything we've documented, the legal process is complex and often frustrating. Robert Sullivan is still her legal guardian. Unless we can prove immediate danger, he has rights that the court will protect. Family reunification is always the primary goal, even when the family is clearly dysfunctional." "What about Lily's rights?" Eleanor demanded, her voice rising enough that other people in the cafeteria turned to look. "What about her right to be safe, to be fed properly, to be loved and cared for and protected from harm? When do her rights matter more than a father's rights to keep failing her?" Sarah had no answer to that, and in the silence that followed, both women felt the weight of a system designed with good intentions, but too often failing the most vulnerable people it was meant to protect. That afternoon, everything changed. Robert Sullivan called the hospital, his voice slurred but demanding, asking to speak to whoever was in charge of his daughter's care. Dr. Brennan took the call and afterward informed Eleanor with barely concealed disapproval that the hospital had no legal grounds to keep Lily beyond the medically necessary treatment period. Her eyes had healed sufficiently. The chemical burns were responding well to treatment. She could be discharged within 48 hours unless Child Protective Services obtained an emergency custody order, which would require court approval and sufficient evidence of imminent danger. 48 hours, Eleanor repeated, feeling time compress around her like a vice, squeezing the air from her lungs. That's not enough time to ensure this child's safety. "It's what we have," Dr. Brennan said, his tone suggesting the matter was closed for discussion. "I suggest you focus on your actual patients and let the proper authorities handle this situation. You're becoming too emotionally involved, Eleanor, and that clouds professional judgment." But Eleanor couldn't let it go, couldn't simply return to routine when a child's safety hung in the balance. That evening, when Lily should have been excited about possibly going home, She instead became withdrawn and silent, retreating into herself so completely that she barely responded when Eleanor came to check on her. When Eleanor tried to talk to her about it, gentle questions about how she was feeling, the child finally broke down. Tears streamed down her face as her small body shook with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient inside her, a well of pain that had been building for years. "I don't want to go back," Lily sobbed, her words barely comprehensible through the crying. "I know I'm supposed to love him because he's my daddy, but I'm scared all the time. I'm so scared and so tired, and I just want—" Her words dissolved into crying so deep it seemed to come from somewhere fundamental and broken inside her, the sound of a child who had carried burdens far too heavy for small shoulders. Eleanor held her, this child who wasn't hers but somehow was, feeling Lily's small body tremble against her chest, and felt something crystallize inside her, a determination that went beyond professional obligation into something more primal and fierce. She thought of protocol and procedure, of rules and regulations and the proper channels that were supposed to protect children, but so often failed them. Then she thought of Lily returning to that house, to a father who couldn't provide adequate care, to a life of fear and hunger and loneliness and constant vigilance, and she knew what she had to do, regardless of the consequences to her career or reputation. The next morning, Eleanor called an emergency meeting with Sarah Chen and presented a plan she had spent the entire night researching and organizing. She had barely slept, instead making phone calls, pulling together resources and documenting everything with the thoroughness of someone who knew this might be her only chance. She had contacted a family in the community, the Fosters, who had a history of emergency foster care placement and excellent references. She had documented every medical finding, every conversation with Lily, every piece of evidence that demonstrated she was at risk of serious harm if returned to her current living situation. Most importantly, she had prepared a formal statement declaring that, in her medical opinion as a physician with over 3 decades of experience, returning Lily to her father's care at this time would constitute immediate danger to the child's physical and emotional well-being. "You're putting your career on the line," Sarah warned, though there was unmistakable admiration in her voice and expression. "If this goes wrong, if we can't make the case stick in court, Dr. Brennan and the hospital administration will not be happy. You could face professional consequences, possible reprimand from the medical board, even loss of privileges at this hospital. Are you absolutely certain you want to do this?" Eleanor thought about her career, about the 32 years she'd dedicated to medicine, about her reputation and her standing in the medical community. She thought about the comfortable retirement she'd been planning, the travel she'd hoped to do, the peaceful final years she'd envisioned. Then she thought about Lily's tear-stained face, about the way the child flinched at sudden movements, about the careful hope in her voice when she'd asked if Eleanor would really come back. She thought about promises made and promises kept, and about what kind of person she wanted to be when her own life was measured and assessed. "I can live with professional consequences," Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady with conviction. "What I can't live with is standing by and doing nothing while a child suffers. I won't do it. Not again, not ever." The "not again" hung in the air, heavy with meaning that Sarah didn't press her to explain, sensing there was a deeper story here, something personal driving Eleanor's fierce determination beyond this single case. But there wasn't time to explore it now. They had less than 24 hours to build a case strong enough to convince a judge that Lily needed emergency protection, that the risk of leaving her in her current situation outweighed the system's preference for family preservation. The clock was ticking, and for the first time in years, Eleanor Hayes felt like she was doing exactly what she was meant to do, living up to the oath she'd taken so many years ago to first do no harm. Consequences be damned. The pieces were in motion now, and there was no turning back. Sarah Chen worked through bureaucratic channels with renewed urgency, filing emergency petitions and gathering statements from neighbors and school officials who had witnessed Lily's situation from different angles. Mrs. Martinez, Lily's teacher, provided a heartbreaking account of a child who hoarded food from the cafeteria, hiding rolls and fruit in her pockets to take home, who wore the same clothes for multiple days in a row, who flinched at sudden movements and loud voices, who excelled academically despite clear signs of exhaustion and malnourishment. The school counselor admitted with evident guilt that they had been concerned but hadn't known how to proceed, hadn't wanted to make false accusations or break up a family unnecessarily. Each testimony added weight to the case, painting a comprehensive picture of systemic failure and a child in desperate need of intervention. Eleanor stayed at the hospital that day, her official shift long since ended, ignoring the pain in her joints and the exhaustion pulling at her. She sat with Lily, reading stories, playing simple card games she'd brought from home, trying to give the child a few hours of normalcy before everything potentially fell apart. Lily seemed to sense something important was happening, asking questions Eleanor couldn't fully answer without frightening her or making promises she might not be able to keep. "Am I in trouble?" Lily asked at one point, her voice small and worried, eyes searching Eleanor's face for truth. "No, sweetheart, you're not in trouble at all," Eleanor assured her, smoothing the child's hair back from her forehead with gentle fingers. "You haven't done anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions to keep kids safe. That's what's happening now. We're trying to figure out the best way to make sure you're safe and taken care of properly." "Is my daddy in trouble?" This question was harder to answer honestly without coloring Lily's perception of a father she clearly loved despite everything. "Your daddy is sick, Lily. Not the kind of sick that I treat with medicine for your body, but sick in his heart and his mind. He's struggling with problems that are very hard for grown-ups to handle. Problems that make it difficult for him to take care of himself and you the way he wants to. He needs help, the kind of help that takes time to work." Lily was quiet for a long moment, her small face serious with thought beyond her years. Then she said something that broke Eleanor's heart into even smaller pieces. "I used to try to be really, really good so he wouldn't be sad anymore. I would clean the house and be super quiet when he was sleeping and never ask for things I wanted. But it never worked. No matter how quiet I was or how much I cleaned or how hard I tried not to need anything, he still kept getting sadder and drinking more. I thought maybe I wasn't being good enough, like maybe if I tried harder, things would get better." Eleanor had to excuse herself and step into the hallway, where she leaned against the wall, and allowed herself 30 seconds to cry, to feel the overwhelming injustice of a 7-year-old child believing she was responsible for fixing her parents' broken places, for thinking she could somehow be good enough to cure addiction and depression and grief. Then she wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath and went back in with a smile on her face, because Lily needed her to be strong, needed at least one adult who could hold it together. As evening approached, Sarah called with news. A hearing had been scheduled for the following morning before Judge Patricia Morrison, who was known for being tough but fair. Robert Sullivan had been located at a friend's apartment and served with papers informing him of the emergency custody petition. He would appear before the judge to contest the state's intervention. Everything would come down to what happened in that courtroom, to whether the judge believed the evidence presented was sufficient to warrant removing a child from her parents' care. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep despite her body's desperate need for rest. She lay in her bed in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. Robert Sullivan could present well when sober, could promise to change and make those promises sound convincing, could convince a judge that he deserved another chance to be the father Lily deserved. The system favored keeping families together whenever possible, believing that children belonged with their biological parents, even when those parents were struggling. She understood the reasoning. Foster care could be traumatic. Separation could cause lasting psychological harm, and many parents did successfully rehabilitate themselves when given support and resources. But she also knew that in the time it took for rehabilitation to work or fail, children continued to suffer, continued to live in unsafe situations, while adults debated and decided their fates. She thought about calling her daughter Anna, seeking comfort or advice or just a friendly voice in the darkness. But it was late, and she didn't want to worry her. Instead, Eleanor found herself looking through old photographs and albums she hadn't opened in years. Pictures of her children when they were young and life was full and uncomplicated by loss and loneliness. She thought about how lucky she had been, how different Lily's childhood was from what her own children had experienced, and felt the weight of that unfair cosmic lottery that gave some children safety and others only struggle. Somewhere in the city, Robert Sullivan was presumably preparing for the hearing, perhaps getting sober enough to appear in court, perhaps practicing what he would say to convince a judge he could be the father Lily needed. Eleanor tried to feel compassion for him, to remember that addiction was a disease, that poverty and loss and untreated mental illness had broken him as surely as any physical injury. But compassion was hard to hold when she thought about Lily's malnourished frame and fearful eyes, when she remembered the careful way the child ate, as if food might disappear at any moment. Morning came too quickly and too slowly, time behaving strangely as it did when something important loomed on the horizon. Eleanor dressed carefully in professional clothes that would make the right impression in court, gathered all her documentation into a neat folder, and drove to the courthouse through early morning traffic. Sarah met her outside the imposing brick building, accompanied by the Fosters, Margaret and John, a couple in their early 60s, with kind faces and patient eyes that spoke of people who'd seen hardship and responded with gentleness rather than hardness. They had agreed to take Lily as an emergency placement if the judge approved the petition, opening their home to yet another child in crisis. "How's she doing?" Margaret asked Eleanor before they entered the courthouse, genuine concern evident in the way she leaned forward to hear the answer. "She's frightened but brave," Eleanor replied, thinking of Lily waiting back at the hospital with Maggie, who had volunteered to stay with her during the hearing. "She's the strongest child I've ever met, which honestly breaks my heart because children shouldn't have to be that strong. They should be allowed to just be children." The courtroom was small and intimidating, filled with the formal trappings of legal proceedings that seemed designed to make ordinary people feel small and powerless. Wood paneling, high ceilings, the judge's bench elevated above everyone else, the witness stand isolated and exposed, all of it calculated to inspire respect for the law's authority. Robert Sullivan arrived with a court-appointed attorney, and Eleanor got her first look at Lily's father. He was younger than she'd expected, probably early 30s, but looking older, worn down by years of hard living. He was clean-shaven for the hearing, wearing clothes that were old but neat, his hands shaking slightly as he took his seat at the defendant's table. His eyes, red-rimmed and shadowed with dark circles, held a desperate quality that spoke of someone drowning and grasping at anything to stay afloat, willing to make any promise if it might save him. The hearing proceeded with testimony from Sarah, who presented her findings from the home investigation with professional detachment that didn't quite hide her own emotional investment in the case. From Eleanor, who detailed every medical finding, every injury documented, every sign of neglect she had observed during Lily's hospitalization, speaking in the precise language of her profession while trying to convey the urgency she felt. From Mrs. I. Martinez, who had been subpoenaed to appear and testified about Lily's situation at school with tears in her eyes, talking about a bright child whose potential was being stifled by circumstances beyond her control. Each person painted the same picture from different angles: a child in crisis, a father unable to provide adequate care, a situation that had been deteriorating steadily for years with no intervention until now. Eleanor presented her medical findings with professional precision, detailing every injury, every sign of neglect, every indicator that Lily was at risk of serious harm if returned to her previous living situation. She spoke about the chemical burn, about the old bruises in various stages of healing, about the malnutrition evident in the child's small size and low weight for her age. She talked about the fear she'd observed, the hypervigilance, the way Lily flinched at sudden movements and loud voices. She presented the hospital records from other facilities, showing a pattern of injuries, and she made her professional opinion clear. Returning Lily to her father's care at this time would place her at imminent risk of harm. When Robert Sullivan took the stand, his testimony was painful to witness. His attorney tried to present him in the best possible light, emphasizing his love for his daughter and his willingness to make changes. But Robert's own words told a more complicated story. He admitted to drinking too much, acknowledged losing his job and struggling to find consistent work, talked about his depression and his inability to properly care for his daughter. He talked about his wife's breakdown, about watching the woman he loved disappear into illness that he couldn't fix or understand, about the factory closing and his inability to find steady work in a town where good jobs had disappeared, along with the manufacturing base. He cried openly, his voice breaking as he said, "I love my daughter more than anything in the world. I know I've failed her. I know I'm not the father she deserves, but she's all I have left of the life we used to have. Please don't take her away. Please give me one more chance. I promise I'll do better. I'll stop drinking, I'll get help, I'll do whatever it takes." The judge, Patricia Morrison, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and an expression that revealed nothing of her thoughts, listened to everything with careful attention. She asked pointed questions, pressed for specific details, clearly taking this decision seriously despite the packed docket that awaited her attention. When all testimony had been heard, when both attorneys had made their final arguments, she took a long moment before speaking, reviewing her notes with the deliberation of someone who understood the weight of what she was about to decide. "Mr. Sullivan," she finally began, looking directly at the man whose fate she held in her hands, "I don't doubt that you love your daughter. The love you feel for Lily is evident in your testimony and in your emotional response to these proceedings. But love alone is not sufficient to provide a child with a safe and stable home. The evidence presented here today indicates a pattern of neglect that has placed your daughter at significant risk of harm. However, I'm also aware that this situation is the result of multiple systemic failures, economic, social, and medical, that have affected your family over several years through no fault of your own." She paused, her gaze moving to each person in the courtroom before returning to Robert. "I am granting temporary emergency custody to the state, with placement to be made with the foster family presented by Child Protective Services. However, Mr. Sullivan, this is not a termination of your parental rights. This is an intervention designed to ensure your daughter's immediate safety while you receive the help you clearly need and deserve. You will be required to complete a substance treatment program, maintain stable employment or income sufficient to support yourself and contribute to your daughter's care, and demonstrate that you can provide a safe home environment meeting minimum standards. Visitation will be supervised and scheduled through Child Protective Services. If you can show sustained progress over the next 6 months, we will revisit the custody arrangement. Do you understand?" The gavel came down, the sound echoing through the courtroom like a door closing on one chapter and opening on another. Robert Sullivan collapsed forward, his shoulders shaking with sobs, his attorney placing a hand on his shoulder but offering no words of comfort because there were none to give. Sarah and Eleanor exchanged glances that held relief and sadness in equal measure, understanding that this was both victory and tragedy, that sometimes protecting children meant breaking families apart, even when everyone involved was doing their best. As they left the courtroom, stepping out into sunshine that seemed too bright after the dimness inside, Margaret Foster touched Eleanor's arm gently. "We'll take good care of her, Dr. Hayes. I promise you that. We've done this before, and we understand what she's been through. She'll be safe with us." Eleanor nodded, not quite trusting herself to speak around the emotion clogging her throat. They made arrangements for Lily to be transferred from the hospital directly to the foster home that afternoon, sparing her the trauma of seeing her father in his current devastated state. Later that afternoon, Eleanor helped Lily gather the few belongings she'd accumulated during her hospital stay. The books Eleanor had brought from home, some clothes donated by the hospital's charity program, the stuffed bear that had belonged to Anna, the drawings and pictures she'd created during the long days of her stay. Lily was quiet, her expression unreadable, processing changes too big for a 7-year-old mind to fully comprehend. "Am I going to live with those people now?" Lily asked as Eleanor helped her put on her coat, fingers fumbling slightly with the zipper. "With Margaret and John, yes," Eleanor confirmed, kneeling down so they were at eye level. "They're very nice people who help children who need a safe place to stay for a while. They have a house with a yard, and they said they've prepared a room just for you. Will you come visit me? The question, asked with such careful hope, made Eleanor's decision for her. Yes, Lily. I'll come visit you as often as they'll let me and as often as you want me to. Do you promise? Lily's eyes searched Eleanor's face, looking for truth in a world where adults had proven unreliable. Eleanor thought about all the broken promises in Lily's short life, about the weight of making one more. Then she thought about how far they'd already come, and how much further they still had to go. And she knew that some promises were worth making even when the future was uncertain. I promise, she said firmly, holding Lily's gaze. And like I've told you before, I always keep my promises. Always. For the first time since Eleanor had met her, Lily smiled. A real smile that reached her eyes and lit up her thin face, transforming her from a frightened child into a glimpse of the happy girl she could become with time and care and safety. It was like watching sunrise after a long, dark night, and it made everything worthwhile, every sleepless night and difficult conversation and risk taken. As Eleanor watched Lily leave the hospital with the Fosters, Margaret holding the child's hand gently, while John carried her small bag of belongings and chatted easily about the room they'd prepared and the dinner Margaret had planned. She felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. Some moments deserved tears, deserved the acknowledgement of their emotional weight, and this was definitely one of them. Doctor. Brennan found her standing there in the parking lot, watching until the Foster's car disappeared from view, and cleared his throat uncomfortably. The board wants to see you tomorrow morning, Dr. Hayes. There are questions about your involvement in this case, about whether you overstepped professional boundaries and violated protocols regarding objectivity and appropriate distance from patients. Eleanor turned to face him, and he actually took a step back from the steel in her expression and the fire in her eyes. Tell the board I'll be there, she said calmly, her voice steady. And tell them I'd do it all again without a moment's hesitation. Some things are more important than protocol. That night, Eleanor finally called her daughter Anna, needing to hear a friendly voice, needing to share the weight of the past few days with someone who would understand and not judge. Anna listened to the whole story without interrupting, then said quietly, Mom, I'm so proud of you. What you did for that little girl, standing up for her when no one else would, risking your career and reputation to make sure she was safe. It was exactly what you should have done. It was exactly what I would want you to do. Dad would be proud too. They talked longer, about other things, easier things, catching up on family news and daily life. And for the first time since Michael's death, Eleanor felt like maybe she was finding her way back to something resembling connection and purpose. Maybe helping Lily wasn't just about saving a child. Maybe it was also about remembering that she still had purpose beyond just filling time until her own life ended. Still had the strength to fight for something that mattered. Still had something meaningful to contribute to the world. The next few weeks brought changes for everyone involved in Lily's case. Robert Sullivan entered a 30-day residential treatment program, choosing sobriety over fighting the court's decision, finally accepting that he needed more help than he could find on his own. The hospital board reprimanded Eleanor officially with a formal letter in her file, but took no further action, perhaps recognizing that her violation of protocol had ultimately led to a child's rescue, perhaps unwilling to face the public relations nightmare of punishing a doctor for protecting a vulnerable patient. Lily began settling into life with the Fosters, a process that had moments of light and darkness in equal measure, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, progress measured in small victories rather than dramatic transformations. Eleanor visited twice a week as she'd promised, and each time saw small signs of healing that gave her hope for the future. Lily was eating better, gaining weight slowly but steadily, her cheeks filling out and color returning to her pale skin. Her eyes, which had healed physically within days of the original injury, were beginning to heal emotionally too, showing less fear and more curiosity about the world around her, lighting up when she talked about school or showed off drawings she'd made. The nightmares were still frequent according to Margaret, dark dreams that left Lily crying and confused in the middle of the night, and there were moments when she'd withdraw into herself, unreachable and silent. But there were also moments when she'd laugh at something silly John said, or help Margaret bake cookies and get flour all over herself, or draw pictures of flowers and sunshine and rainbows instead of the dark, empty houses she'd drawn in the hospital. Margaret proved to be exactly the kind of steady, patient presence Lily needed. She didn't push for affection, or try to replace Lily's mother, or force connection before the child was ready. She simply provided routine and safety and kindness without expecting anything in return, understanding that trust had to be earned slowly with children who'd learned the world was dangerous. John, who had worked as an elementary school custodian before retiring, had a gentle manner with children and endless patience for Lily's questions and fears, answering the same worried questions multiple times without frustration. Together, they created an environment where a frightened child could begin to understand what home was supposed to feel like. Safe and predictable, warm and welcoming, a place where adults took care of children instead of the other way around. Eleanor, for her part, found herself transformed by the experience in ways she was only beginning to understand. She'd entered this situation thinking she was saving a child, but in many ways, Lily had saved her too, reminded her why she'd become a doctor in the first place when she was young and idealistic, pulled her out of the lonely routine she'd fallen into after Michael's death, given her purpose beyond just filling time with work until her own life ended. She began attending grief counseling, something she'd resisted for years despite Anna's gentle suggestions, and slowly started processing her own losses and loneliness rather than just covering them with work and exhaustion. One evening, about 6 weeks after Lily had moved in with the Fosters, Eleanor arrived for her regular visit to find Lily playing in the backyard. The child was laughing, genuinely laughing in a way Eleanor had never heard before, as she chased bubbles John was blowing from a bottle of solution, trying to pop them before they floated away. The sound of that laughter, bright and free and full of joy uncontaminated by fear, made everything worth it. Every sleepless night, every bureaucratic battle, every moment of doubt about whether she was doing the right thing. Margaret stood beside Eleanor on the back porch, both women watching the scene unfold like a painting of normalcy and childhood as it should be. "She's getting stronger every day," Margaret said softly, pride evident in her voice. "Still has hard moments when she remembers or gets scared, but the good moments are starting to outnumber them. She's resilient, this one. She's going to be okay." "Thank you," Eleanor said, meaning it from the depths of her soul. "Thank you for giving her this chance to be a child, to feel safe, to heal." "We're just providing the space," Margaret replied with characteristic modesty. "She's doing the hard work of healing herself, resilient than we give them credit for, but they need the right environment to heal." As Eleanor prepared to leave that evening, Lily ran up and threw her arms around Eleanor's waist in a spontaneous hug, something that had become more frequent as the child learned that physical affection could be safe and welcome, rather than threatening. "I drew you a picture," Lily said, pressing a folded piece of paper into Eleanor's hand with paint-stained fingers. "It's you and me and the rainbow we're going to see someday when everything is happy." Eleanor looked at the drawing. 2 stick figures holding hands beneath a vibrant rainbow, done in enthusiastic crayon strokes, with flowers dotting the ground and a large yellow sun smiling down from a bright blue sky. She carefully folded it and put it in her purse like the treasure it was, knowing she would frame it when she got home. "I'll keep this forever," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. "It's the most beautiful picture anyone has ever given me." And she did keep it, hanging it eventually in her office at the hospital where she could see it every day. A reminder of why she did the work she did, of the difference one person could make when they chose to act instead of looking away, when they chose compassion over convenience. That picture would become one of her most prized possessions, more valuable than any award or commendation she'd received in her long career. Robert Sullivan completed his residential treatment program 30 days later, participating fully in group therapy, individual counseling, and educational sessions about addiction and recovery. He transitioned to outpatient care, attending meetings and counseling sessions religiously, finding work doing maintenance at a local church where the pastor, a man named Father David who believed in second chances, gave him an opportunity when few others would. It was modest work that paid barely above minimum wage, but it was steady, and more importantly, it gave Robert structure and purpose, two things that had been missing from his life for too long. The supervised visits with Lily began 2 months after she'd moved in with the Fosters, scheduled weekly at a neutral location with a social worker present to observe and ensure the child's safety. They were difficult at first, painfully strained and uncomfortable, with Lily withdrawn and hypervigilant, watching her father's every move as if expecting him to transform back into the person she feared. Robert tried too hard initially to make everything okay, bringing gifts they both knew he couldn't afford, talking too much to fill the awkward silences, making promises about the future that nobody was ready to hear yet. But gradually, with the help of a family therapist named Dr. Lisa Chen, who specialized in reunification counseling, they began finding a new way to relate to each other, building something different from what they'd had before. The therapist taught Robert how to be present with his daughter without overwhelming her, how to acknowledge what had happened without making excuses, how to demonstrate through consistent action rather than empty words that he was changing. She taught Lily that loving someone didn't mean excusing their harmful behavior, that she was allowed to have complicated feelings about her father, that healing wasn't linear, and she could take as much time as she needed. In one particularly powerful session about 3 months into visitation, Robert did something the therapist had been preparing him for. He apologized, really apologized, without qualifications or explanations that minimized his responsibility. "Lily," he said, his voice steady despite the tears running down his face, "I want you to know that everything that happened was my fault, not yours. You were just a little kid trying to survive in a situation that no child should ever have to face. I was supposed to take care of you, to keep you safe and make sure you had food and clean clothes and felt loved. Instead, I was so lost in my own pain and my drinking that I couldn't see how much you were hurting. I failed you in every way a father can fail a child, and I am so sorry. You deserved so much better than what I gave you." Hearing those words seemed to unlock something in Lily that had been held tight since the night of the chemical burn. She began talking about her fears and her anger, her confusion about loving someone who had hurt her through neglect and absence, even when he was physically present, her guilt about being relieved to be away from him and living with the Fosters. The therapist helped them both navigate these complicated emotions, creating a space where truth could be spoken without fear of punishment or rejection, teaching Robert how to be a healthier presence in his daughter's life even if he wasn't her daily caretaker, teaching Lily that she had permission to feel everything she felt without guilt or shame. Eleanor continued her regular visits to the foster home, becoming something like an honorary grandmother in Lily's expanding circle of support and care. She brought books and read stories with different voices for each character that made Lily giggle, helped with homework when Lily struggled with math problems, listened to excited chatter about school and friends and the art class she'd joined. She also continued providing medical care when needed, treating minor illnesses with the same attention she'd give any patient, making sure Lily attended all her checkups and follow-up appointments, ensuring this child who'd been invisible for so long was now thoroughly seen and cared for by multiple people who had her best interests at heart. On Lily's 8th birthday, 6 months after the hearing that had changed everything, the Fosters threw a small party at their home. It was the first birthday party Lily could remember having, and her excitement was infectious in the days leading up to it. She helped Margaret plan the menu, chose the decorations from catalogs Margaret brought home, wrote out invitations for her school friends with careful printing that showed how seriously she took the task. Eleanor arrived early on the day of the party to help set up, stringing streamers and balloons, while Margaret put finishing touches on a homemade cake decorated with flowers and butterflies. When guests began arriving, school friends with wrapped presents, Mrs. Martinez, who'd remained a supportive presence and brought a gift card for art supplies, Sarah Chen, who'd become more than just a caseworker but a genuine friend to the family. Lily's face glowed with happiness that transformed her completely. She wore a new dress Margaret had bought for the occasion, her hair pulled back with a ribbon, looking healthy and strong and nothing like the frightened child who'd arrived at the emergency room 6 months earlier. But the moment that mattered most, the one that would stay with Eleanor forever, came when Robert arrived for his scheduled visit, carrying a carefully wrapped present and walking with the careful posture of someone who knew they were on probation, but was determined to prove themselves worthy. Lily's initial tension was visible, her body stiffening and her smile fading slightly, but Margaret gently encouraged her with a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, honey. He's here because he loves you, and today is about celebrating you. You get to decide how you want this to go." Lily approached her father slowly, each step deliberate, and Robert knelt down to her level as the therapist had taught him, making himself less physically imposing. He handed her the present with hands that trembled slightly. "Happy birthday, Lily Bug," he said softly, using the nickname from when she was a toddler, before everything fell apart and the world became complicated and painful. Lily opened the gift carefully, preserving the paper because she'd learned not to waste anything, to find a journal with her name embossed on the leather cover, and a set of colored pens in every shade imaginable. "For writing stories or drawing or whatever you want," Robert explained, his voice catching with emotion. "The therapist said it might help to write down your feelings sometimes, and I know you always had such an imagination when you were little. I remember you used to make up stories about talking animals and magical places. I thought maybe you'd like to write them down now." "Thank you, Daddy," Lily said, and for the first time in their supervised visits, she initiated a hug, wrapping her thin arms around his neck. It was brief, still somewhat tentative, nothing like the unguarded hugs small children usually give their parents, but it was real and genuine. Robert's eyes filled with tears as he held his daughter for those few precious seconds, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something sacred, the beginning of forgiveness, not forgetting because the past couldn't be erased, but perhaps the start of a different kind of relationship built on honesty instead of fear, on accountability instead of empty promises. The party continued with cake and games and the joyful chaos of children playing together, running through the house and yard with the boundless energy of youth. They played pin the tail on the donkey and musical chairs, ate too much cake and ice cream, opened presents with appropriate expressions of delight and gratitude. Eleanor stood with Margaret and John and Sarah, watching Lily at the center of it all, surrounded by people who cared about her, and felt a sense of completeness she hadn't experienced in years, a feeling that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. "She's going to be okay," John said quietly, echoing Margaret's earlier assessment. "It'll take time, and there'll be setbacks when something triggers a memory or when she has a bad day, but that little girl is going to make it. She's got too many people fighting for her to fail." Eleanor nodded, believing it with a certainty that came from witnessing transformation firsthand. Not because Lily's past had been erased or because all the damage had been magically undone, but because Lily now had what every child deserved, a safe place to heal, adults committed to her well-being who showed up consistently, and the understanding that she mattered, that her life had value, that she was worth fighting for. As the party wound down and guests began leaving with goodie bags Margaret had prepared, Robert prepared for his departure. His visitation was limited to 2 hours, and though the restrictions chafed and he clearly wanted to stay longer, he followed them without complaint, understanding they were necessary for rebuilding trust that had been shattered. Before he left, he approached Eleanor, who was helping collect wrapping paper and party debris. "Dr. Hayes, I never properly thanked you for what you did," he said, his hands shoved deep in his pockets as if he didn't know what else to do with them. "You saved my daughter when I couldn't, when I was too lost in my own problems to see how badly she needed help. I was angry at first, felt like you took her from me, like you were judging me and finding me worthless. But I understand now that you gave her a chance at a real life, at being safe and cared for the way she always should have been. So, thank you. Thank you for seeing her when I couldn't, for fighting for her when no one else would." Eleanor looked at this man who'd been broken and was slowly, painfully putting himself back together piece by piece, and chose her words carefully, aware that what she said mattered. "Robert, you love your daughter. That was never in question, not for a moment. But love has to be more than just a feeling or an intention. It has to be action, consistency, safety, putting their needs ahead of your own wants. You're doing the hard work now to become the father she needs, and that takes tremendous courage and strength. Most people who fall as far as you fell don't climb back up. The fact that you're here sober and showing up consistently means something important. Keep going. Keep doing the work. Your daughter needs to know she can count on you, and you're proving that more every day." They shook hands, two people who'd been on opposite sides of a painful situation, finding common ground in their shared desire for Lily's well-being. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it was understanding and mutual respect earned through consistent action rather than empty words. After everyone had gone and the house was quiet again, Eleanor helped the Fosters finish cleaning up, while Lily played with her new toys in the living room, occasionally calling out to show them something particularly exciting. The child seemed tired but happy, a combination Eleanor had rarely seen in their early days together, a sign of normal childhood exhaustion from a good day rather than the bone-deep weariness of chronic stress. As Eleanor prepared to leave, gathering her coat and purse, Lily ran up with her new journal clutched to her chest. "Will you write something in here, Dr. Eleanor? Something I can read when I'm older and maybe don't remember everything that happened?" Eleanor sat down at the kitchen table and thought carefully about what message she wanted to leave, what words would matter years from now when Lily was grown and looking back on this chapter of her life. Finally, she wrote in careful script, "Dear Lily, you are brave and strong and worthy of love, and you always have been even when people couldn't show you that properly. Never forget that your story doesn't end where it began. The hard parts of your past are not your fault, and they don't define your future or limit what you can become. You have so many people who believe in you and are cheering for you every single day. Dream big, work hard, be kind to others, and most importantly, be kind to yourself. You deserve all the good things life has to offer. Love always and forever, Dr. Eleanor." She showed Lily what she'd written, and the girl carefully read each word, her finger following the lines with the concentration of someone for whom reading was still an effort, but also a source of pride. "What does this part mean about my story not ending where it began?" Lily asked, looking up with those eyes that had seen too much, but were learning to see beauty again. "It means that just because your life started out hard, doesn't mean it has to stay that way forever," Eleanor explained, pulling Lily close so they could look at the journal together. "You get to write new chapters now, better ones filled with happiness and safety and people who love you. And we're all going to help you do that. But you're the main character, the hero of your own story. You get to decide what comes next." Lily considered this seriously, her young face thoughtful in a way that made her look older than her 8 years. Then she nodded with determination. "I think I'd like to write some happy chapters now. I'm tired of sad ones." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Eleanor agreed, her heart full to bursting. "The best idea I've heard in a long time." As she drove home that night, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope, but not the naive kind that ignored reality. This was the hard-won kind that came from witnessing transformation up close, from seeing how people could survive terrible things and still find ways to heal, and grow and move forward. She thought about the chain of small decisions and actions that had led to this point. Her choice to stay late that first night instead of going home, to look beyond the immediate injury to the larger pattern of neglect, to fight through bureaucracy and risk her career, to keep showing up even when progress seemed impossibly slow. One person couldn't fix a broken system or solve all the problems that led to children's suffering. But one person could make a difference in one child's life, and sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that small act of care rippled outward in ways that changed multiple lives. Lily's, obviously, but also Robert's as he fought for sobriety and redemption, the Fosters who opened their home, Sarah who renewed her commitment to fighting for vulnerable children, Even Eleanor herself, who'd found purpose again, after years of just going through motions. Over the following months, the pattern continued. Slow, steady progress marked by small victories and occasional setbacks that were expected and managed rather than catastrophic. Lily's nightmares decreased in frequency, happening only once or twice a week instead of nightly, and she developed better coping strategies for when they did occur. Her weight climbed steadily into the healthy range for her age, her cheeks filling out, and her arms losing that skeletal thinness that had alarmed Eleanor initially. Her confidence grew as she joined the after-school art club and discovered a real talent for painting, creating vibrant pieces that showed imagination and emotional depth that impressed her teachers. She made friends who invited her to sleepovers and birthday parties, normal childhood experiences she'd missed out on before, and she learned gradually how to be a child rather than a miniature adult constantly on guard. Robert maintained his sobriety with the vigilance of someone who knew one slip could cost him everything that mattered. He continued attending AA meetings 3 times a week, seeing his individual therapist, and showing up for every scheduled visit with Lily without fail. He moved out of his friend's apartment into a small studio of his own, modest but clean and sober, a space he could be proud of. The court eventually expanded his visitation rights from supervised to monitored check-ins, acknowledging his sustained progress and genuine commitment to change. He and Lily were learning to be father and daughter in a new way, one built on healthier foundations where honesty was valued over pretense, where he didn't pretend to be perfect, and she didn't have to pretend everything was fine. They talked about hard things with the therapist's help, processing pain and fear and anger that had been buried for too long. Margaret and John, seeing how well Lily was thriving in their care, and how much they'd grown to love this resilient child, began the process of applying for long-term foster care, with the eventual possibility of adoption, if that proved to be in Lily's best interest. They weren't trying to replace her parents or erase her history, but they wanted to ensure she had permanency and stability, a forever home where she would always be welcome and loved regardless of what happened with Robert's rehabilitation. Sarah Chen continued monitoring the case, but her visits became less frequent, as it became clear this placement was stable and working well for everyone involved, that Lily was safe and cared for and thriving. Eleanor reduced her hours at the hospital, finally acknowledging her own physical limitations and need for balance between work and personal life. Her arthritis required more attention, and her cardiologist had expressed concern about stress levels and their impact on her heart health. She used the extra time to volunteer with organizations supporting at-risk children, turning her experience with Lily into broader advocacy work, speaking at conferences and training sessions about the importance of looking beyond immediate symptoms to see the whole child. She also reconnected with her own family, visiting Anna and her grandchildren more frequently, rebuilding relationships she'd neglected during the years she used work to avoid grief. She even started dating again after 5 years of widowhood. Nothing serious but companionship that reminded her life still held possibilities for connection and joy. One day in early spring, almost a year after that fateful night when a scared little girl had called 911, Eleanor arrived for a visit to find Lily and Margaret working in the garden, planting vegetables and flowers. The transformation was remarkable. Lily's hair had grown longer and was pulled back in a neat ponytail. She wore clothes that fit properly and showed her personality with bright colors and playful patterns, and she looked healthy and strong, and nothing like the malnourished child who'd arrived at the emergency room. Her laugh rang out clear and genuine as she accidentally got dirt on Margaret's nose, a sound of pure childhood joy that made Eleanor's heart soar. "Doctor, Eleanor, come see what we planted," Lily called out enthusiastically, waving with a dirt-covered hand, her face lit up with excitement. Eleanor joined them in the garden bed where they'd planted tomatoes, peppers, herbs, and flowers in neat rows marked with handwritten labels. Lily excitedly explained each plant, what it would become, how they had to water it regularly and give it sunshine and be patient while it grew strong. Then she said something that showed wisdom beyond her years, an understanding that came from lived experience. "It's kind of like people, isn't it?" Lily said thoughtfully, gently touching a tomato seedling with surprising delicacy. If you take care of them and give them what they need, like food and water and sunshine and patience, they can grow strong and beautiful, even if they started out small and fragile and maybe got hurt before. They just need the right environment and people who don't give up on them. Eleanor and Margaret exchanged glances over Lily's head, both women recognizing the profound truth in the child's observation, the understanding she'd gained through her own journey of healing. "That's exactly right, sweetheart," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's exactly right, and you're the perfect example of that. You've grown so much this year, not just bigger but stronger in every way that matters." As they worked together in the garden, dirt under their fingernails and sun warming their faces, Eleanor reflected on how much had changed in 1 year. The system that had failed Lily initially had eventually worked. Not perfectly, but well enough to make a real difference in one child's life. A man who'd been drowning in addiction and depression had found his way to the surface and was learning to swim, rather than just survive. A child who'd known only fear and neglect had discovered safety and care, and was learning what it meant to be loved properly. And a doctor who'd been sleepwalking through her own life, using work to avoid grief and loneliness, had woken up and remembered what mattered most: connection, purpose, fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Later that afternoon, as Eleanor prepared to leave, Lily presented her with a painting she'd made in art club. It showed a house with bright yellow windows glowing warmly, flowers in every color dotting a green yard, and 4 figures holding hands: Margaret, John, Lily, and Eleanor, all together under a smiling sun. In the corner, standing slightly apart but still part of the picture, was a 5th figure that Eleanor recognized as Robert, connected to the group by a thin line showing he was separate but not absent, part of the story, even if not part of the daily reality. "This is my family now," Lily explained, her voice carrying pride and contentment. "Margaret and John, who take care of me every day. You, who saved me and still visits all the time, and somewhere out there, my daddy, who's getting better. It's different than I thought families were supposed to be when I was little. But Mrs. Martinez says families come in all different shapes, and what matters is love and safety, not who's related by blood. And I think she's right. I think this is pretty good. Maybe even better than good." Eleanor accepted the painting with tears in her eyes, knowing immediately where it would go, on her living room wall where she'd see it every single day. "I think it's absolutely perfect," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Just like you." And she meant every word, because families did come in all forms, biological and chosen, traditional and unconventional, connected by blood or bound by commitment. And what mattered wasn't their structure, but their foundation of love and safety and consistent care. As Eleanor hung the painting in her living room that evening, placing it in the spot of honor above the fireplace where she'd see it every morning when she came downstairs, she understood that she'd been changed by this experience as profoundly as Lily had. She'd entered into this situation thinking she was the rescuer, the strong one who would save the weak and vulnerable. But Lily had taught her about resilience, about the human capacity to heal even from the deepest wounds, about hope and courage, and the importance of showing up day after day even when progress seemed impossible. The phone rang, pulling Eleanor from her thoughts. It was Anna calling for their now regular weekly chat, a ritual they'd established and both looked forward to. As Eleanor settled into her favorite chair to talk with her daughter, she looked at Lily's painting on the wall and felt gratitude wash over her like warm sunlight. Sometimes the most broken situations could be mended, not perfectly, not without scars that would always remain as reminders, but mended nonetheless into something functional and even beautiful. Sometimes when you saved someone, you saved yourself too, finding purpose and connection you didn't even know you were missing. And sometimes when you kept a promise to a frightened child in a hospital room, when you chose to act instead of looking away, you didn't just change their life, you changed your own in ways that rippled outward, touching everyone around you, creating circles of healing that expanded beyond what you could see or measure. Eleanor fell asleep that night thinking about gardens and growth, about seedlings that became strong plants when given proper care, about children who became healthy adults when given safety and love. She thought about Lily laughing in the spring sunshine, about Robert fighting every day for sobriety and redemption, about Margaret and John opening their home and hearts, about all the small acts of kindness and courage that had combined to create something larger than any individual contribution. And she understood finally that this was what life was supposed to be about, not avoiding pain or pretending the world wasn't broken, but showing up anyway, fighting for what mattered, choosing compassion over convenience, action over apathy. One person couldn't save everyone, couldn't fix all the broken systems or solve all the world's problems, but one person could save one child, could make one crucial difference at one critical moment, and sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was everything. The end of Lily's story as a frightened child, and the beginning of her story as a girl with a future full of possibilities, had been written by many hands: doctors and social workers, teachers and foster parents, therapists and friends, even a father finding his way back from the darkness of addiction. But it had started with one doctor who chose to see beyond the immediate injury to the child who needed saving, who chose to fight when it would have been easier to look away, who kept showing up long after her professional obligation ended, because she'd made a promise and promises mattered. As spring turned to summer and summer to fall, Lily continued growing and healing, writing those happy chapters she'd talked about wanting. She painted pictures of sunrises and rainbows, made friends and got good grades, learned to ride a bike with John's patient teaching and baked cookies with Margaret's gentle guidance. She visited her father regularly and slowly rebuilt trust that had been shattered, learning that people could change if they did the hard work consistently. She talked to her therapist about hard things and gradually let go of the guilt she'd carried for problems that were never hers to solve. And throughout it all, Eleanor was there. Not every day, not hovering or inserting herself where she didn't belong, but present in the way that mattered most, showing up consistently, keeping promises, being one more person in Lily's corner who wouldn't give up on her no matter what. That's what healing looked like in real life. Not a sudden transformation or miraculous cure, but slow, steady progress, marked by small victories and sustained by people who cared enough to stay. It looked like garden rows carefully tended, like appointments kept and promises honored, like laughter replacing tears and hope replacing fear one day at a time. And in the end, wasn't that what every child deserved? Not perfection, because perfection didn't exist in this broken world, but people who showed up, who fought for them, who saw their worth even when they couldn't see it themselves. Lily had that now, finally, and it made all the difference, every single difference.